The following program is intended for mature audiences.
Rudy's Revelation.
Are you implying here some kind of conspiracy?
Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode. It is October 2nd, Wednesday. So I didn't have time to get together with Perry last night on a debate roundup. We're going to have a special edition of Tuesdays with Perry tonight, Wednesday night. So it's all about the vice presidential debate. If you didn't see it, I'm going to run down some headlines today for you. For some reason, I'm going to start off with the mainstream media, but for some reason, they brought up, important policy of abortion and climate change, which isn't even registering on the minds of voters. But let's get into the headlines, and I'll tell you what happened. All right, so we're going to start out with the mainstream media. Here's the Associated Press. Vance and Walz keep it civil in a policy-heavy discussion. And then they talk about the VP debate takeaways. Reuters has the headline, Walz and Vance clash politely at policy-heavy vice presidential debate. You could see a theme here. The most tense exchange occurred near the end of the debate. This is from Reuters, when Vance, who said he would not have voted to certify the results of the 2020 election, avoided a question about whether he would challenge this year's vote if Trump loses. These are all side issues and nobody cares. Walz responded by blaming Trump's false claims of voter fraud for instigating January 6, 2021 mob that attacked the U.S. Capitol in an unsuccessful effort to prevent the certification of Joe Biden's 2020 election. I'm just going to stop here and say this is a side issue that most voters don't care about. January 6th was what it was, but it doesn't matter about the future. I mean, the Democrats will because they hate MAGA and they hate Trump and whatever. But it really didn't have a place in last night's debate. My take on last night's debate was, and which is echoed out there, that it's very similar to the last debate on ABC, where the moderators took the side and provided cover for the weaker candidate. On ABC, it was Kamala Harris, and last night, the vice presidential candidate, Tim Walz. They had more pointed questions and fact checks and cutting off the mic of JD Vance and interrupting JD Vance, and the way they allocated time to whom and when and how much. When JD Vance got his rebuttal time, it was always prefaced by another question or a correction or the need for JD Vance to clarify something. And when Tim Walz got his rebuttal time, they just said to him, you got 2 minutes. And unfortunately for JD Vance, the shortcomings he did have is he didn't use up all his time, which left the time for the moderators to correct him or to challenge him on things he might have said. This was a policy-heavy debate, but the questions that were presented were not on what was really on people's mind. They covered a lot of territory, which, was good, but a lot of things like, okay, you could put in abortion, but climate change, it didn't even register on any polling of voters that thought climate change was the top, one of the top issues. Going back to the Associated Press, highlights from the Vance-Walz vice presidential debate. Fact focus from AP. Walz overstated the cost of insulin, which he did. Vance falsely, mind you, falsely linked unaffordable housing to immigrants who have come into the country illegally. Now, I hate when journalists, and they know better than this, to use the term falsely. So they could have said Vance claimed there was a link in unaffordable housing to immigrants. And they keep saying in immigrants, it's illegal immigration. So they don't want to call it illegal immigration because they're calling them asylum seekers falsely. And this is my point, is that when they say fact-focused Walz overstated or exaggerated, which many people do, and the Vance falsely linked, and they can't say falsely linked because you cannot prove that unaffordable housing in some way is affected by the waves and waves of millions, tens of millions of illegal immigrants coming across the southern border, even by plane. And I'll get to that in just a second. The AP went on to say Walz pushed Vance on the senator's claim that Trump, who tried to eliminate the law, actually helped preserve it, which indeed was a fact. So they got into a spar about the Affordable Care Act. You know, they went off on all these tangents that aren't really on the minds of most people. Sure, the Affordable Care Act, sure, affordable anything is important. But the reality about Obamacare is that the Republicans had many chances to remove Obamacare and didn't because it would add political consequences. But they got rid of, and people aren't talking about this, that during this discussion about Obamacare, the fact is that Trump kept in the acceptance of pre-existing conditions. And that is one of the most important things. However, during a terse exchange, where the moderators, of course, interfered, was the fact that JD Vance was pressing Walz on, do you agree with the mandate? And the mandate by the Supreme Court was ruled unconstitutional, so it was removed. But most of the rest of Obamacare stayed in place. So the Republicans had a chance to remove it. They didn't. And Trump was concerned of getting rid of something that forced insurance companies to take people with pre-existing conditions. But you get rid of the mandate, and then the whole argument is about, well, young people aren't part of the pool or whatever. Young people don't get insurance because they don't get sick. So the pool shouldn't be, you shouldn't force people who don't get sick to get insurance if they don't want to. That's just constitutionally. Okay, so the mainstream news kind of didn't end, but this is the UK Express. JD Vance's eyeliner steals spotlight in vice presidential debate as fans say it's putting Tim Walz off. Now, this is a claim about JD Vance wearing eyeliner. He doesn't wear eyeliner. He has eyelashes that stand out. So I don't think he wears eyeliner. So I don't know why the left keeps bringing this up. They don't have much to talk about otherwise, except for abortion, and they brought up climate change, which is a weird thing to bring up during the debate, which I didn't think was fair to do because nobody cares. Then the New York Times chimed in, civility, and then a clash over January 6th, 7 takeaways from the debate. Senator JD Vance of Ohio and Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota sparred over immigration, abortion, and foreign policy. There wasn't much foreign policy in there at all. And then on Donald Trump's 2020 election loss. And they go on to say Republicans, including Donald Trump himself, are attacking Walz for saying that on the debate stage that he'd become friends with school shooters, which he did say. His campaign says that he misspoke, obviously, and that he meant to say he'd become friends of the families of school shooting victims. He obviously misspoke, and he said he misspoke about other things as well, including his lies. So the thing about the school shooter remarks is that it is a big gaffe. Now, you could hold Joe Biden to account for all the things he said. Does he make gaffes? Yes. Are those literal gaffes? Did Tim Walz actually mean he became friends with school shooters? But it's a gaffe enough and important enough to point it out that he made a gaffe and didn't correct himself after he said it. So when you say things like, I became friends with school shooters, that's a weird thing to say. And he was visibly shaken during the debate, and he started bugging out his eyes and acting weird. I'm surprised he didn't gesticulate wildly like he usually does. OAN reports Walz says, I've become friends with school shooters. This isn't indeed the fact that we were just talking about. Did he misspeak? Yes. Do people actually believe he became friends with school shooters? No, but he made a very terrible gaffe, a strategic gaffe of sorts, that it just was strange. Was it a Freudian slip? Did he really become friends with school shooters? Obviously, the campaign had to come out and correct it, because the fact is the candidates don't, and the same thing with Kamala Harris, they don't come out and say, hey, I misspoke. I obviously didn't mean that. So the next headline up from PJ Media is Tim Walz gets spanked in debate with JD Vance. It's overwhelmingly reported that JD Vance won. He was cooler. He played the conservative game, which I didn't really like. There were a lot of open throat moments where you wanted him to attack on a number of different things, which I wish he would have. Later tonight with Perry, I'm going to go down. We were texting during the debate, so I'm going to go down the line of some of the things that came up to me during the debate. So I'll get into some of those opportunities where I thought JD Vance could have pounced and didn't, but he didn't want to come across as mean also, which I looked at a few points during the debate. I was like, oh, if this was Trump, he would have went for the jugular. Just the News also reported no breakouts in polite VP debate as Walz calls himself a knucklehead. Vance spars with moderators, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. So the knucklehead comment. Now, this came out of a discussion about, and the CBS moderators tried to appear fair, like the CNN people did. They did not. Just in their timing and the way they cut off JD Vance when there was that spar, which you're going to get to in just a second, where they cut his mic. But the knucklehead comment. This was about when the moderators asked, and we're going to get to a lot of things here in just a second. A lot of parts of the debate. They asked him about, he said he was in Tiananmen Square he was in China during the Tiananmen Square massacre. So he wasn't. He was in Hong Kong, and it was a month after or a month before. I forget exactly when Tiananmen Square was. But he lied about that. So they called him on him to clarify and talk about his lie. He didn't. He dodged the question many times, and Maggie Brennan called him again on it. And he said, sometimes I'm a knucklehead. And then when asked again about it, because what was weird when they asked him about it originally, in the first question, he went into, I grew up in a small town. And it's like, what are you even talking about? And that's all they go to is, hey, I'm a middle-class guy. It's like they're asking you whether you were or you weren't. That's not a time to go into your history. And I didn't like the fact that JD Vance did that at the beginning of the debate. Hey, I grew up in a blah, blah, blah. Whatever, you're introducing yourself to America, okay. But when you're asked pointedly, did you or didn't you? And you go, hey, I grew up in a small town. They're trying to dodge the question, which he did. So they pointed it out several times. He said, I'm a knucklehead. And then when he was asked the last time, he said, I misspoke. Okay. Everybody misspeaks. Sometimes you say things or use words that aren't appropriate, whatever. I get it. I do it. But he did say he was a knucklehead. Who the hell wants to vote for somebody who admits he's a knucklehead? One American News, Walz stumbles during first question of VP debate, confuses Israel and Iran. Here's another gaffe. He basically said that they were talking about foreign policy right off the bat with Iran launching missiles, and he confused Israel and Iran right off the bat. And so that was a gaffe. Did he misspeak? Sure, he misspoke. But this is what we're talking about is you don't want to have a head of state or whatever making a lot of misspoken gaffes, because if you're talking to foreign leaders or people that really matter, they don't know what you mean, especially if they're hearing it through a translator or what have you. It's important. Fox News is reporting top 5 clashes between Vance and Walz during debate showdown. Your mics are cut. Gentlemen, the audience can't hear you because your mics are cut. Moderator Margaret Brennan said at one point during the debate. And now we're getting to the juice of the matter, which is the moderators were unfairly bolstering Tim Walz. And I say this because, and it's the same thing with Donald Trump, there are softball questions. It's JD Vance, why are you such an incorrigible monster and bigot? And then Tim Walz, why are you so how could you possibly be so wonderful and caring? You know, that's not the way you ask questions during the debate. So let's get into the Fox News for a second. Okay. Voter panel reacts to Vance clash with debate moderators. Mike cutoff. You're fact checking me. Now, what was said here? Now they show a graph, and don't listen to Fox, by the way. So a focus group of Republicans, Democrats, and Independents reacted to the former President Trump's running mate, Senator JD Vance, microphone being cut off during the CBS News vice presidential debate on Tuesday night. Independent and Republican voters disapproved of the interjection. Right. So the moderators interjected unfairly. So, and I'm going to get into why he was talking in a second, the next paragraph. But independent voters dipped significantly when Vance began explaining his stance. Now, people might have glossed over. I don't know why you would be an independent at this point. But let's talk about what is going on here. So, despite CBS announcing that it would not allow live fact-checking during the debate, moderator Margaret Brennan, who I call Maggie, interjected to correct Vance after he suggested that illegal immigrants are overwhelming public resources in Springfield, Ohio. This is the problem. They didn't say they would live fact-check, but they kept doing this smarmy, arrogant thing, recharacterizing, which is unfair to do by a journalist during a debate, particularly. Mischaracterizing or recharacterizing things that JD Vance said. And they didn't do it and just let me stop here and say this. 2 things. First, engage the channel, like, subscribe, leave a comment, and most specifically, share the podcast. Give me a thumbs up. Appreciate it. First of all, it was obvious that the CBS News and their moderators rehearsed with Tim Walz. It was a choreographed show between the moderators and the known quantity of Tim Walz and his rehearsed answers. Very similarly as what was done in ABC News presidential debate. They were obviously rehearsed. Now, did they get together physically? Maybe not. But notes were shared. They might have even live debated, and it looks like it was rehearsed because they would ask things of Tim Walz, and he was ready with his answer. The exact answer ticked all the boxes and was not corrected or pushed or prodded He was bolstered. Anyway, back to this article from Fox News. Just to clarify for our viewers, said Margaret Brennan, Springfield, Ohio does have a large number of Haitian migrants who have legal status, temporary protected status, Brennan said. And then JD Vance went on to say, the rules were that you guys, misgendering, weren't going to fact check. Vance reminded them. And since you are fact checking me, I think it's important to say what actually is going on. Now, Fox doesn't even go into the facts of this. Now, there's an app, it's a law that has existed that you can apply for temporary status as an illegal immigrant. You can apply for temporary status. And the people that do this, and Tim Walz says this, first of all, this app didn't exist since 1990. This has been a law since 1990, but the Biden administration developed an app that apparently is all on all illegal immigrant phones where you could just apply for temporary status. So illegal immigrants granted temporary status on a blanket basis, they're still illegal immigrants. They cross the border illegally, whether you call them asylum seekers or what have you, and then you granted them blanket temporary status. They're still illegal immigrants for all intents and purpose. That's what JD Vance was trying to clarify. But the fact that he was making this point because he thought the recharacterization of his point by Maggie Brennan was misleading to the viewers, which it was. So that's the point I'm trying to make. And they don't go into the fact that, and Fox doesn't even go into that boring fact. And that's why independent voters started to gloss over, because it's like, oh, you're telling us about apps and stuff. Are they legal or not legal? Well, you can grant blanket amnesty to people just like they're doing with the people they're letting in over the border and flying in. They're asylum seekers. So why they're characterized as migrants, they're asylum seekers, what have you. Going back to the headlines, the morning briefing by PJ Media, JD Vance did a great job against Nora O'Donnell and Margaret Brennan. Indeed, because he held them to task. And this is the point, is they're not paying attention. The moderators and the Harris-Walz campaign orchestrated this debate, brought up only issues that Democrats care about, climate change. Voters don't care about this in this election cycle. I'm not saying it's not an issue. Climate change, abortion, and they didn't really talk about some of the more important things like foreign policy, foreign wars, getting embroiled in foreign wars. They touched on it a little bit, but only very briefly, and most particularly the economy. And not once was inflation addressed, only by JD Vance. I believe he mentioned it once. They talked about the border, and there was a tit for tat. Who caused the border? Who's good on the border? Who's doing what on the border? And they made it a mess of a discussion when it was obvious that, as JD Vance stated, that the border crisis was caused by the Biden administration, Harris included. And JD Vance kept on bringing up border czar. But that's when it got interesting. So the Federalist is reporting Vance calls out Democrats' First Amendment crackdown. Harris is engaged in censorship on an industrial scale. And indeed they are. And this was a good tack by JD Vance. And this what really had him slam dunk the debate. Now, censorship wasn't brought up as a question by the moderators, but he pivoted to that and he closed with that. What they did bring up, and this is how he pivoted, they brought up, of course, abortion and climate change, and they brought up dangers to democracy. And so this was a great pivot by JD Vance where he said, the greatest danger to democracy is the limiting of fundamental rights, particularly censorship. which the Biden administration has been engaged in collusion with social media companies and the like. They want to force people to get their news and to communicate on social media, but then they want to go in and censor what the people have to say. And this was a good pivot by JD Vance. Now, getting back to the moderators, again from the Federalist, Vance to corrupt moderators. You broke the rule on real-time fact-checking, so I'm going to fact-check you. Now, we went into this previously, and the point that made everybody mad is that they weren't going to allow JD Vance to challenge the moderators. And that's when they cut his mic. And that's the problem. Because these moderators were obviously biased. They're corporate media protecting the corporate candidate, Kamala Harris, and her vice presidential candidate, Tim Walz. So he called them out and they immediately cut off his mic. That's bullshit. Because if the moderators are going to lightly recharacterize something to benefit one candidate and to change the context of what JD Vance was trying to get across, of course he should have challenged them. And that's the problem, is they go, oh, we're not going to cut the mics. You know, there's going to be open mic. And so the candidates can challenge each other, but don't you dare change, you know, don't you dare try to challenge the corporate moderators. Terrible, terrible, terrible. So also the Post-Millennial has CBS fact checks JD Vance over migrant crisis, cuts his mic, and then when he tries to respond, and this is where JD Vance goes on to say, so there's an actual application called the CBP1 app where you can go on as an illegal migrant, apply for asylum or apply for parole or be granted legal status at the wave of a Kamala Harris open border wand. There it is. And that's what they didn't want to hear. They didn't want to have one of the debate candidates, in this case the Republican, recharacterize or characterize their mischaracterization, or they're obviously trying to obfuscate the real issue here, which was, excuse me, I have a technical issue, which was the fact that they're still illegal immigrants who are granted temporary status. So if you're granted temporary status, you're still considered a legal immigrant, but you can't be forcibly removed. That's the whole issue behind that. So going back to the knucklehead question, Mediaite, I'm a knucklehead. Walz gives a disastrous answer when questioned on inaccurate claims at debate. So Mediaite tries, even Mediaite characterizes that answer as disastrous. So can you say I'm friends with school shooter? Oh, he misspoke. But when you say I'm a knucklehead, who wants a knucklehead in the White House? Is that really what you want as an independent voter? Not as the independent voters are watching this. So, but more to the case, the Federalist again, how does Tim Walz explain his stolen valor controversy? Well, the CBS moderators didn't bother asking. So they challenged him on whether he went to China during Tiananmen Square. They didn't bother to ask him how many times he had been to China, or exactly explain to the American people why you were taking high school students to communist China, why you have an affinity for communist China. Didn't bother. The word communist doesn't come out of their mouths. Doesn't really come out of mainstream media at all. When they talk about China, communism is never even mentioned. It's just another country. You know, they'll talk about despots where, you know, they'll refer to Viktor Orban, the president of Hungary, as a dictator, even though he's democratically elected. But they'll never refer to Xi Jinping as being a dictator or as the communist government in China as being authoritarian. But did we hear about a stolen valor? No. Are you ready to admit to the American people, Tim Walz, that you were not a sergeant major, that you were just a sergeant? All right, moving on to the headlines of post-millennial again. Tim Walz says he misspoke when he claimed he was in Hong Kong for the Tiananmen Square massacre. We know that to be true. National Review says JD Vance defies media caricature with polite first impression. Indeed, he's a master. He's an intellectual. He has high intellectual capacity. I don't want to say he's an intellectual. High intellectual capacity to think on his feet, to keep his composure. A lot of times when he looked into the camera, which was good, when he heard, I would have challenged Tim Walz when he lied and said, as Trump would do, you're lying. But he just gave this coy look at the camera, which might have been more effective. He was trying to play the conservative game, and he was trying to come off as polite, as National Review characterized it as to differentiate himself from Donald Trump, which would have went on the attack. So when other people would see Donald Trump and see an exposed jugular and Donald Trump would go for it, Vance resisted the chance. Fine. Going back to the mainstream media a bit, the Washington Post, Vance refuses to say Trump lost in 2020, sparking debate's biggest clash. I don't think I'm going to get into this article because, again, this was a cul-de-sac. This was kind of a red herring. The fact that they bring it up is just to bludgeon the Republicans with what we know is an organized attempt to make a riotous crowd at a rally, which if you've ever been to a Trump rally, they never get riotous. But at this stage in the game, a riotous crowd make them commit crimes. And in fact, we have people like, what's that guy's name? Who actually encouraged people to go into the Capitol, which is trespassing, which they knew they could just spin into whatever. And then you have the thing with the pipe bombs, who were obviously put there by the FBI to be discovered, because the discovery of the pipe bombs would just be able to unleash more law enforcement infiltration, penetration into the crowd. So moving along, though, the point is with the January 6th thing, again, it was just to bludgeon the Republicans with. It's not an issue that people care about, particularly independents. The post-millennial, again, JD Vance says threat of censorship is the real threat to democracy, not January 6th. I believe that we actually do have a threat to democracy in this country, but unfortunately, the threat to democracy is that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz want to talk. They don't want to talk about. It's the threat of censorship, indeed. More headlines. Democrat. Before I get into that, my parting thought, and I have a couple more parting thoughts, but just at the end of that, it burns me the thing about January 6th, because it was an organized infiltration to get the crowd to commit crimes and then be prosecuted for those crimes and call it criminal. And then it was an armed insurrection. And then they were trying to overturn the election when all they were trying to do was pause the certification or stop. At least some, including the New York Times, will say there is an attempt to stop the certification, indeed to stop it, to make time to investigate what seemed to be erroneous election results. So I want to get to that in a minute as well. So getting back to headlines here, separate headlines. Democrats sued, this from OAN. One American News, Democrats sue Georgia State Election board overrule requiring counties to hand count number of ballots cast. Now, they already suffered a defeat when the Georgia State Board of Elections removed, I think it was close to 1 million, it was 700,000 people from the voter rolls that were on there illicitly. So that was a defeat. And one of the things the state election board said is that they have to hand count the number of ballots cast. Again, this is important, but if you have mail-in balloting without signature verification, that means little. That means you could just dump millions of ballots. You won't be able to do millions again because there's, they took those names off the voter, but certainly those ballots will be checked against the voter rolls. And that's why they're going to do the hand count. Moving back to unrelated news, Mediaite Whoopi Goldberg claims Hollywood is a very right-leaning town. Right-leaning compared to where Whoopi Goldberg sits. I mean, she's a socialist. And again, you should check out, I just watched the interview with Tim Walz, Mike Lee on Tucker Carlson. They went over the debate, the vice presidential debate. And this is the fact, is it's so funny because Whoopi Goldberg, as I said yesterday, Whoopi Goldberg is a leftist. And what Tucker Carlson and Mike Lee went on to explain is the fiscal problem this country has with $1 trillion annual debt service, which is more than what we spend on the military. Is anybody getting this? So, Hollywood is not a right-leaning town. Whoopi Goldberg is very far left, and she thinks, like most far-left people, that you can just throw money at problems, even if we don't have the money to solve the problems with money. And that's the problem with leftists, liberals. They want to spend money on problems that sometimes never get fixed. Okay, like the Biden administration paying billions of dollars, I think hundreds of billions of dollars, to install electrical car chargers across the United States. They put in 8. Okay, that's a boondoggle by its very definition. Okay, so Gavin Newsom spent tens of billions of dollars trying to fix the homeless problem in California, where it only got worse. Okay, more headlines. On the economic front, One America News, CVS Health to cut nearly 3,000 jobs nationwide. But I thought their jobs were growing under the Biden-Harris administration. Is that what people want? More of the same? More of the same? I don't know. I hope not. Harris-Biden's illegal alien airlines program is an unmitigated fraud. This is from PJ Media. There are far more illegal aliens coming into the country under Biden and Harris than at any time anyone can remember. Why? They're flying them in. Indeed, they're letting convicted rapists and murderers into the United States, which we know about this stat that was released by ICE. But also, the Biden administration briefly paused their illegal immigration airline program, but then they resumed it. And the reason is they're saying, oh, look, there are not so many migrants coming over the southern border. Well, the fact is they don't have a lot coming over the southern border in the summer because a lot of people end up dying that way. So what they did is they just started flying them in. So the numbers actually didn't cease at all. There were just less border encounters, because it was summer, it's too hot. But the number really didn't change of immigrants coming into the country, illegal immigrants coming into the country, asylum seekers, because they're being flown in. Other headlines I want to touch on here from the LA Times: shattering glass ceiling, Claudia Sheinbaum takes office as Mexico's first female president. You heard that correctly. Claudia Sheinbaum, Mexico's first president. Not Garcia, not Sanchez, Sheinbaum. Now, it's clear that the globalists have again been able to force a DEI hire into the presidency, and this time in Mexico. Another headline I want to touch on, this is from the AFP. California passes a law allowing Dutch-style cannabis in cafes. Now, I don't have a problem with this law. My problem was with Connecticut. Why didn't we do it that way? In Connecticut, you have to go in to a state-run lobby. You have to sign in. They check your ID. You know, you're put into a database to go buy marijuana. Why can't you just go into a cafe and smoke? No one takes your ID or anything. And that's the problem, is like, you don't go into a liquor store and buy a bottle of whatever. They don't check, you know, they might check your ID to see if you're of age, but they don't register you. And this way, this would get the marijuana smokers off the street, which I agree. I don't think you should be able to smoke in public. Should it be against the law? No. But I think you should be discreet. If you like certain parks, Bryant Park in New York City, you go into it, it's just a cloud of marijuana smoke. I don't think that's fair to the people that don't smoke marijuana. So I think there should be cafes where you can go inside and smoke. Going back to the article, starting this year, diners in western U.S. state of California can smoke cannabis at certain restaurants thanks to a new law allowing cannabis cafes. Goes into effect January 1st. I'm for that. I'm for the freedom to do that. I just don't, my problem is registering. I don't even like, if you need to get background checked or whatever to get a gun, fine. Right? But I don't think you need to register to get a license. And a matter of fact, I only think you need a license to fish in place where the states stock, because that's how you pay for the stocking. You know, there's got to be a quid pro quo when you deal with the government. Otherwise, hands off. More headlines from the Washington Post. AI assistants are blabbing about embarrassing work secrets. So they're just admitting that the AI is spying on you, if you didn't know already. Fancy investors aren't the only one getting burned by AI features. Rank and file employees are also at risk of AI-powered tools recording and sharing damaging information. And they go on to say technology is proliferating so fast, people aren't really internalized how invasive it is. Of course it is. Sometimes AI note takers catch moments that weren't meant for outside ears. Anything connected to the internet can spy on you. Either, you know, this is the problem with AI, is that people are like, nobody's going to take the time to spy on me, right? Because I'm not doing anything wrong. But it doesn't matter. AI, they could record, and this is the surveillance model. They record everything that you do online. They record every time you're near something online. So they're recording your movements and then what they do is AI maps it out, and then AI goes through all the transcripts and flags certain things. And that's stored in your dossier forever. So 12 years from now, they could come out and say, oh, look, you talked about porn or watched porn or whatever. Okay, other unrelated headlines. The Dispatch, what happened to Tucker Carlson, the strange journey of a pundit, Trump whisperer, and potential 2028 presidential candidate. I don't know about that. The deal with this article is it was, oh my God, like a 60-inch article, even more. It was like a magazine-style article where it goes through Tucker Carlson's history. I hated Tucker Carlson when he was on Crossfire and CNN. He was a complete idiot, and he'd make fun of 9/11 truthers. And this article is all based on 9/11 truth. And the fact comes, and I'm going to go back to the article right now. In an appearance at Joe Rogan podcast last year. Well, before I go, I just want to say something, is that Tucker Carlson was a 9/11 narrative pusher, right? That, the terrorists took down 3 skyscrapers in Manhattan and blew up the Pentagon, the most secure building in the world, and blah, blah, blah. We know that's not the case, because despite what you think of 9/11, there is no way that two structures in New York City, the Twin Towers, fell in the exact same way on the exact same day when they were hit with two airplanes. Now, you can go along with NIST and say, oh, because of the way they were constructed, there was a design fault, even though nobody says there was a design fault, and that the towers were weakened and then they collapsed in the same way because they were built basically the same. All right, there's no way. Physics says there's no way. All right, there's no way to get mass out of the way to have buildings fall at free fall speed. There's no way to get the mass out of the way, no failure of such without demolition. So you could say no. Okay, but then you look at one or both of the tower collapses. They ejected hundreds of tons of concrete and steel outward. Now, how does that happen? Now, you look at it, and if you're thinking your basic physics, and sorry to go on a diatribe here, but your basic physics, where you're like, oh, something pushes down and the air pushes out debris or smoke, maybe. Okay, maybe smoke, but not hundreds of tons of debris. Air doesn't push hundreds of tons of debris. Only explosions do. So there was obviously explosion that forced the debris out of the way. So look at the film again. Also, Building 7 is which they talk about here, which I'm going to get to right now. Building 7 didn't have a plane hit it, so it collapsed in the same way as the other two towers on the same day. But 10 hours later, I mean, come on. What's happening here now? All right. So in any way, I guess the powers that be, the internet powers don't like me talking about that. So the Dispatch goes on to say in this article about Tucker Carlson in an appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast last year, Carlson promoted 9/11 conspiracy theories by mocking the idea that Building 7 of the World Trade Center, a 47-story office building north of the Twin Towers, could have collapsed the way it did due to jet liners flying into the Twin Towers. Agreed, because it only had fires burning on several floors. Not caused by jet fuel, or unlikely caused by jet fuel. He spoke of why he used to get angry when he heard Alex Jones talking about 9/11. The reason that I did was because if you call that into question, you had to ask a lot of other really obvious questions you didn't want to deal with. And you might arrive at the conclusion that a lot of your most basic assumptions are false and that you've heard, been had, and just too destabilizing maybe, in any case. Then Rogan then pointed to the evidence that no Building 7 conspiracy. There was a diesel generator there in the basement, so they have all this fuel, so they have an incredible inferno in the basement that weakens the structure. Is that why it collapsed? Maybe. Totally impossible. A lot of building engineers disagree with that, There's no way. And there was no explosion in the basement. You could see it's a controlled demolition. The standard crimp, then the building imploding into its own footprint. Didn't topple over. It doesn't work that way. They tried to make some condo tower in Florida collapse in the same way, but, Florida's swampland. It's, In any case, I was watching Alex Jones at the time where Tucker Carlson came on the show and had an open debate about 9/11, particularly Building 7, which Tucker Carlson at the time said he knew nothing about. And ever since you're faced with the truth, like Tucker Carlson was, and you do your own research, you find out what the truth really is. And the truth really is facts or claims substantiated by attribution and corroboration. So do whatever you want to do, play with whatever facts you want to play with, believe whatever you want to believe, but you got to be faced with certain facts that obviously Tim Walz doesn't understand. Democrat voters don't understand. You cannot sustain illegal immigration at the scale of tens of millions. Okay? You cannot sustain immoral behavior in terms of abortion. And by immoral, I just mean you can't rip out viable fetuses and say it's not murder. Otherwise, you'd have to acknowledge the pro-life people's point of view. And they don't want to do that. There is no climate change, as many people have pointed out. I mean, there is climate change, but is it connected to human activity? That's certainly debatable. It shouldn't even been included in the debate. Tim Walz wasn't held to any of the lies he's told, or any of the lies the Kamala administration has been telling. The border invasion, as many people call it, is actually facilitated by leftist NGO groups that actually go into villages in Central and South America and say, hey, you guys should come to America. We'll pave the way. We'll give you credit cards, so on and so forth. Happens. They didn't talk enough about the threat of World War III. They talked about stuff that really needs to be addressed, which is the fact that the immigration can't continue because we don't have the money. We don't have money for a lot of things. And so we need to pull back, in my personal opinion, be more economically isolationist. America first, America for Americans. You know, people always talk about Africa for Africans. I agree. But America for Americans as well. And I think JD trounced, but that's not the way the left is. They're just saying it was boring. Don't look at it. It wasn't a breakout enough that it should have been. People are calling it a slam dunk. But, you know, I don't know. All right, I went almost an hour. Trying to keep these things short, but I have too much to say, particularly about this debate. I thought JD Vance was too conservative as an approach. We'll see what the polls have to say, because he's trying to win over the independent vote. So that's why he did what he did. And then tonight we're going to have an episode of Tuesdays with Perry, the Wednesday edition of Tuesdays with Perry. We're going to talk about what we thought as we watched the debate. All right, thanks for joining me today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, engage the channel, and give me a thumbs up, and particularly share the podcast. And of course, remember that you're under attack biologically and psychologically. So stay hip to the trick, and I'll see you tonight. Respect.
Are you implying here some kind of conspiracy? The New World Order. The New World Order. The New World Order.
You can't handle the truth.
Rudy's Revelation.